I want to prove that the limit as x approaches 4 of square root of x is equal to 2. So there's going to be two steps here. The first step is going to look at the absolute value of f of x minus my limit being less than epsilon. And the second step is going to look at absolute value of x minus c is less than delta. My goal in these steps is to find x to be in some range. So we're going to get two different inequalities for x. And we're going to set whatever the left side is, the smaller part of the inequality, equal to each other. And then we're going to set the right side, or the greater part of the inequality, equal to each other. So we'll end up having two choices for delta, and we're going to find the smaller of the delta. So let's see how that works. So we're going to start with the absolute value of my function minus my limit being less than epsilon. That means that square root of x minus 2 has to be between negative epsilon and epsilon. And so I'm going to add 2 to both sides. And then I'm going to square it. Okay, so I found my first inequality that involves x. The second inequality surrounding x will deal with x minus the c value, which is 4 here, since we're approaching x equals 4. And we want that less than delta. So that means that x minus 4 has to be between negative delta and delta. And that is 4 minus delta is less than x is less than 4 plus delta. So we have our two inequalities, and the last step is to set them equal to each other. So I'm going to set my 2 minus epsilon squared equal to 4 minus delta, and I'm going to set my 2 plus epsilon squared equal to 4 plus delta. Okay, so let's see how that works. We have 2 minus epsilon squared is equal to 4 minus delta. So that is epsilon squared minus 4 epsilon plus 4 is equal to 4 minus delta. The 4's will cancel. I get epsilon squared minus 4 epsilon equals to negative delta. So that means delta has to be 4 epsilon minus epsilon squared. So that's our first delta. Our next delta, we need to set 2 plus epsilon squared equal to 4 plus delta. So we're going to have epsilon squared plus 4 epsilon plus 4 equal to 4 plus delta. The 4's will cancel, and we'll have delta equal to epsilon squared plus 4 epsilon. Okay, the last step here is to find the smaller delta. So we want to find the minimum between 4 epsilon minus epsilon squared and 4 epsilon plus epsilon squared. And here epsilon is positive. So in the first piece here, we're subtracting two positive numbers, and the second one we're adding two positive numbers. So obviously 4 epsilon minus epsilon squared is the delta that's going to work. Okay, let's try another one. So let's say we have limit as x approaches 9 of square root x minus 5 equals 2. Okay, here I'm going to first do my absolute value of f of x minus my limit. It's less than epsilon. And the second step, I'm going to be looking at the absolute value of x minus c being less than delta. And again, I want to find a range for x, so then I can choose what delta is going to be. So let's begin. I have the absolute value of x minus 5 minus my limit less than epsilon. And that means that negative epsilon has to be less than absolute value of x minus 5 minus 2 less than epsilon. I'm going to add 2 to all the sides. So we'll have 2 minus epsilon is less than x minus square root x minus 5 less than 2 plus epsilon. And then I can square both sides. And then finally I'm going to add 5. Okay, and so we found our first inequality that involves x. Okay, so the second step now, we're going to be looking at absolute value of x minus 9 less than delta, since we're approaching x equals 9. And so that is negative delta has to be less than x minus 9 less than delta. We'll add 9 to both sides, so we have 9 minus delta less than x less than 9 plus delta. And that's the other inequality we have for x. So now all that's left to do is to set the two inequalities equal to each other. So what I mean by that is we're going to set the smaller, so the 2 minus epsilon squared plus 5 with a 9 minus delta. So we have 2 minus epsilon squared plus 5 equals 9 minus delta. I'm going to expand the left, so we have epsilon squared minus 4 epsilon plus 4. And we're going to add that to 5 equals 9 minus delta. And so we have epsilon squared minus 4 epsilon plus 9 equals 9 minus delta. The 9's will cancel, and we'll get delta equals 4 epsilon minus epsilon squared. So that's one of them. The other one, we're going to set the bigger part of the inequality equal to each other. So that's this part. So we'll have 2 plus epsilon squared plus 5 is equal to 9 plus delta. That's going to give us epsilon squared plus 4 epsilon plus 4 plus 5 is equal to 9 plus delta. The 4 and the 5 is going to cancel with the 9, and we'll have delta is equal to epsilon squared plus 4 epsilon. And the last step is we want to find the smaller of the two deltas. So again, because we're subtracting two positive numbers, the delta that we want will be 4 epsilon minus epsilon squared. Okay, let's look at the last one. We'll look at a similar one to this. We'll have the limit as x approaches 0 of square root 4 minus x equals 2. We're going to start off with the absolute value of 4 minus x minus 2 is less than epsilon. So that means negative epsilon has to be less than the square root of 4 minus x minus 2, less than epsilon. We're going to add 2. And then we'll square all the sides. We'll subtract by 4. The last step is you want to get x by itself. Here I have negative x, so I'm going to multiply everything by negative 1. So I'm going to have negative times the quantity 2 minus epsilon squared plus 4. And now because I'm multiplying by negative, the inequality switches. And we just apply the negative again. Okay, and that's our first inequality that involves x. The second one, we'll look at the absolute value of x minus 0 is less than delta, since we're approaching x equals 0. So that means x has to be between delta and negative delta, and that's our second inequality. Okay, the last step here is to compare the smaller deltas, the smaller part of the inequalities. So in other words, negative delta with negative 2 plus epsilon squared plus 4, and then we'll compare delta with negative times 2 minus epsilon squared plus 4. So when we do that, we have negative delta equals negative times quantity 2 minus epsilon squared plus 4. And that's going to be epsilon squared minus 4 epsilon plus 4, and then plus 4. The 4 is going to cancel here, and the negative is going to cancel with this negative. So we'll have delta is equal to 4 epsilon minus epsilon squared. And then we'll have delta is equal to negative times 2 minus epsilon squared plus 4. So delta, and that will be negative times the quantity epsilon squared minus 4 epsilon plus 4 plus 4. The 4 is going to cancel, and I'm going to distribute the negative, so I have 4 epsilon minus epsilon squared. So in this case, we have two of the same. So the minimum is just either one of them. So delta has to be 4 epsilon minus epsilon squared.